I still get chills thinking about Harold Brennan, and it's been 3 years since I moved away from Clearwater, Montana. Population 2,847, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, except nobody really knew Harold. Not until the end, when we discovered that everything we thought we knew about human behavior was wrong. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I worked at Clearwater First National Bank for 6 years. Our building sits right on Main Street, with those big picture windows that give you a perfect view of the entire downtown area. That's how I first noticed Harold's routine. Though routine doesn't begin to capture what we witnessed. It started on a Tuesday in March 2019. I was processing the morning deposits when Janet Kowalski, our head teller, tapped me on the shoulder. "Sarah, look at this guy," she whispered, pointing out the window. "I've been watching him for 3 days now, and I swear he's walking to the exact same rhythm." Harold was crossing from the corner of Main and Elm, heading toward Peterson's hardware store. Average height, maybe 5 feet 8 inches, thin build, wearing a navy blue jacket that looked like it had been pressed with military precision. His stride was methodical, not rushed, not casual, but perfectly measured. 47 steps from the corner to the front of Peterson's, where he'd pause, check his watch, then continue down Main Street. "Probably just a punctual guy," I said, but Janet shook her head. "No, Sarah. I mean exactly the same. Same speed, same number of steps, same pause. Yesterday he stepped around Mrs. Miller's flower display, and today he stepped around it in the exact same spot, even though she moved it 3 feet to the left." I started paying attention after that. Every morning at exactly 7:23 a.m., Harold would appear. Not 7:22, not 7:24, always 7:23. The navy blue jacket, khaki pants, brown leather shoes that clicked against the sidewalk in a steady rhythm. His posture never changed, shoulders back, head straight, eyes focused ahead. He never looked left or right, never acknowledged anyone, never deviated from his path. After 2 weeks of this, our entire bank staff was timing Harold's arrival. We'd gather at the windows at 7:20, watching the corner like we were waiting for a parade. When he appeared at 7:23 on the dot, we'd all nod and say, "There he is." It became our morning ritual, watching Harold's morning ritual. But it wasn't just the morning walk. Harold worked at the post office head for 17 years according to Postmaster Williams. Every day at exactly 12 p.m., he'd emerge from the post office for his lunch break. The walk to Murphy's Deli took him exactly 2 minutes and 14 seconds. He'd order the same turkey sandwich on white bread, no mayo, extra lettuce, with a bottle of water. He'd eat at the same corner table, facing the window, finishing at exactly 12:28 p.m. Then he'd walk back to the post office, arriving at 12:31 p.m. I know these times because I started documenting them. So did other people in town. Harold's precision was becoming legendary, but also increasingly unsettling. Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the apartment above the bakery, told me she'd been watching Harold for months. "He's not natural," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Yesterday I dropped a bag of groceries right in front of him, Ken's rolling everywhere. He stepped around them without breaking stride, didn't even look down. What kind of person doesn't react to that?" The stories started piling up. Tommy Morrison, 16 years old, had tried to get Harold's attention by throwing a football directly in his path. Harold had sidestepped it smoothly, maintaining his exact pace, like he'd anticipated the throw. Maria Santos from the coffee shop swore she tried to make eye contact with Harold every day for a month, even waving at him, but he'd look straight through her like she didn't exist. "It's like he's programmed," Janet said one afternoon in late summer. "Like someone wound him up and set him loose." We started calling him Robot Harold. The nickname spread through town like wildfire. Parents would point him out to their kids. "There goes Robot Harold, always on time." Teenagers would dare each other to try to disrupt his routine. But Harold was unflappable. Construction blocking his usual path? He'd take a detour that maintained his exact timing. Sudden rainstorm? He'd walk at the same pace, getting soaked but never hurrying. The whole town became obsessed. We'd time our own activities around Harold's schedule. "Oh, it's past Harold time, I'm running late," became a common phrase. Shop owners would check their clocks when Harold passed. "If Harold's on time, my clock must be right." But obsession turned to unease as the months passed. Harold's precision wasn't just impressive, it was inhuman. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the flower shop, decided to conduct an experiment. She was convinced Harold wasn't actually human, which sounds insane, but you had to witness his behavior to understand her reasoning. Starting in October 2021, she documented Harold's entire daily routine. 7:23 a.m. appears at corner of Main and Elm. 7:27 and 17 seconds a.m. arrives at post office. 12 o'clock p.m. emerges for lunch break. 12:02 and 14 seconds p.m. enters Murphy's Deli. 12:28 p.m. exits Murphy's Deli. 12:31 p.m. returns to post office. 5:47 p.m. leaves post office. 5:51 and 17 seconds p.m. arrives at home, Grey House, for 12 Birch Lane. 8:15 p.m. begins evening walk around the block. 8:26 and 33 seconds p.m. completes evening walk. 9:30 p.m. bedroom light turns on. 10 o'clock p.m. bedroom light turns off. Every single day. 4 months. Mrs. Henderson lived 3 doors down from Harold on Birch Lane, and she became increasingly disturbed by what she observed. "I've never seen him deviate by even a second," she told me, her voice shaking. "I've been watching his house for 2 months. The bedroom light goes on at 9:30 exactly, off at 10 o'clock exactly. I never see him moving around inside. No shadows, no TV flickering, no bathroom light, nothing. It's like he just stops existing between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. She showed me her notebook pages and pages of times, all identical. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a week in late October. "Monday through Sunday, same exact times. But here's the weird part, I tested him." "What do you mean, tested him?" "I started leaving obstacles in his path during his evening walk. A garden hose stretched across the sidewalk, a garbage can position where he'd normally step, even my car parked slightly into his walking path. He navigated around every single obstacle without changing his timing. It's like he knew they'd be there." The breaking point came on November 15, 2021. I was at my desk, processing the morning transactions, when 7:23 arrived and Harold didn't appear. Janet and I exchanged glances, then stared at the empty corner where Harold should have been. 7:24 came and went. Then 7:25. "Maybe he's sick," Janet suggested, but we both knew Harold had never been sick. Never missed a day of work in 17 years, never been late, never been early. By 7:30 other people were gathering outside, looking confused and concerned. Harold's absence felt apocalyptic. We'd all become so dependent on his routine that his missing presence created a void that seemed to affect the entire town's rhythm. Mrs. Patterson came running into the bank. "Something's wrong with Harold," she said breathlessly. "I've been watching from my windows since 7:15. He never came out of his house." Police Chief Rodriguez arrived at 8 a.m., looking as unsettled as the rest of us. "I've got 12 people calling about Harold Brennan," he said. "Never thought I'd be doing a wellness check on someone for being late, but here we are." The walk to Harold's house felt like a funeral procession. Half the town followed Chief Rodriguez down Main Street to Birch Lane. Harold's gray house sat at the end of the street, unremarkable except for its perfect maintenance. The lawn was cut to an exact height, the sidewalk was spotless, and the house numbers were aligned with mathematical precision. Chief Rodriguez knocked on the front door. No answer. He tried the handle, and it turned easily. "Mr. Brennan? Harold? This is Chief Rodriguez, just checking on you." Nothing. What we found inside that house will haunt me for the rest of my life. The living room was arranged with museum-quality precision. Every piece of furniture was positioned at exact angles, not a speck of dust anywhere, magazines stacked with perfect alignment. The kitchen was sterile, dishes arranged by size and color, food in the refrigerator organized first by expiration date, then alphabetically. Canned goods lined up with labels facing forward, spacing between items so uniform it looked like a grocery store display. But Harold's bedroom was where the real horror lay. 17 identical navy blue jackets hung in the closet, each exactly 2.3 inches from the next. 17 identical pairs of khaki pants, perfectly creased and arranged. 17 identical pairs of brown leather shoes, lined up with military precision. Each item looked brand new, like they'd never been worn. The bathroom contained 6 identical tubes of toothpaste, all open to the exact same level. 6 identical razors, 6 identical bottles of shampoo, 6 identical bars of soap. Chief Rodriguez pulled out a ruler and measured every item was spaced exactly 2.3 inches from the next. Jesus Christ, Chief Rodriguez whispered, and I'd never heard him take the Lord's name in vain before. But Harold wasn't there. In the kitchen, tucked inside a manila folder labeled Schedule, they found something that made Chief Rodriguez immediately call the state police, a detailed minute-by-minute breakdown of Harold's daily routine, written in precise handwriting. But it wasn't just a schedule, it was a behavioral analysis. The documents went back 3 years and forward 6 months. Every interaction with townspeople was calculated and planned. 7 hours 23 minutes and 15 seconds step over crack in sidewalk near Miller House. Mrs. Miller watches from kitchen window, expects consistency. 7 hours 24 minutes and 32 seconds maintain 3.2 miles per hour walking speed past Peterson's Hardware. Mr. Peterson times store opening to my arrival. 12 hours 14 minutes and 32 seconds nod at Mrs. Patterson, she watches from apartment window, requires acknowledgement for psychological comfort. 8 hours 17 minutes and 44 seconds avoid eye contact with teenagers near park, direct engagement would disrupt their dare-based behavioral patterns. Page after page of this. Harold hadn't been following a routine, he'd been conducting a study. On us. The state investigators arrived the next morning and discovered Harold's real project, comprehensive files on every resident of Clearwater. He documented our routines, our habits, our psychological patterns, our relationships. He knew that Mr. Peterson unlocked his hardware store at 7:35 a.m. and depended on Harold's timing to gauge his own punctuality. He knew that Mrs. Patterson suffered from anxiety and found comfort in Harold's predictable presence. He knew that the teenagers gathered at the park every evening at 8:15 p.m. and used Harold as a target for their rebellion against adult authority. Harold's files contained photographs taken with a telephoto lens, detailed behavioral observations, and psychological profiles. He'd identified the town's unofficial leaders, the gossip networks, the family dynamics, the economic hierarchies. He'd mapped Clearwater like an anthropologist studying a primitive society. The most disturbing file was labeled Integration Protocols. It contained step-by-step instructions for becoming an accepted member of the community through behavioral manipulation. Create a routine so precise that it becomes part of the town's identity. Never engage directly, but acknowledge townspeople just enough to prevent suspicion. Maintain perfect punctuality to become a trusted time reference. Avoid disrupting social hierarchies while gathering intelligence. Harold had turned himself into a human research instrument, and we'd all been his unwitting subjects. They found Harold 3 days later at a Greyhound station in Billings, 200 miles away. He'd bought a ticket to Denver under the name Thomas Mueller, with identification that looked completely legitimate. When they searched that identity, they discovered Harold's real secret: he'd done this before. His actual name was David Chen, and he'd been moving from small town to small town for over a decade, conducting these elaborate behavioral studies. The FBI found identical situations in Millfield, Iowa, Ridgway, Kansas, and Pinehurst, Oregon. Each time, he'd establish a rigid routine, document the townspeople's reactions and behaviors, then disappear without explanation. In each town, the pattern was the same: arrive quietly, establish an unnaturally precise routine, become a fixture in the community's daily rhythm, then vanish after collecting months or years of behavioral data. The FBI discovered academic papers published under various pseudonyms, analyzing small-town social dynamics using data that could only have come from Harold's infiltrations. Harold David, whatever his name was, never explained his ultimate purpose. Mental health evaluation found him competent, but unwilling to discuss his motivations. He's serving time now for identity fraud, stalking charges, and invasion of privacy. But here's what still keeps me awake at night: how easily we all adapted to him. How we structured our own lives around his routine. How we called him Robot Harold but never questioned why someone would live like that. We were all part of his experiment, and we never even knew it. The FBI agent told me that small towns are perfect for this kind of study because everyone notices patterns, but nobody questions them once they're established. We were like lab rats who'd learned to navigate a maze, never realizing we were being observed and analyzed by something outside our world. I moved to Denver 6 months later. I couldn't stay in Clearwater knowing that for 3 years, someone had been watching us, learning us, documenting our every move like we were insects in a terrarium. Every interaction I'd had, every routine I'd followed, every private moment I'd thought was unobserved, it had all been part of Harold's research. The worst part? I still catch myself looking for Harold at 7:23 a.m., even here in the city. His routine became part of my routine, and I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, he's still watching, still documenting, still studying the next unsuspecting town. My name is Detective Michael Rodriguez, and I've been working for the Riverside Police Department in Northern California for 14 years. I thought I'd seen everything: domestic disputes, missing persons, fraud cases, even a few homicides. But nothing prepared me for the Peterson family at 1847 Maple Grove Drive. What happened with the Petersons still makes me question everything I thought I knew about how people can live, and how easily a community can ignore what's right in front of them. It started with a routine welfare check on December 12, 2021. Mrs. Dorothy Chin, who lived at 1845 Maple Grove Drive, called our department around 3 p.m. She was 73 years old, had lived in the same house for 42 years, and had never called police before. "Officer, I need to report something strange about my neighbors," she said, her voice shaky. "The family next door, I only see them once a year, but I know they live there all the time." I was working day shift that week, and this sounded like a standard neighbor complaint. Maybe boundary disputes, noise issues, or property maintenance problems. I drove out to Maple Grove Drive expecting to mediate some minor suburban drama. Riverside is a quiet town of about 8,500 people, the kind of place where a broken streetlight makes the weekly newspaper. Maple Grove Drive sits in the older residential section, with houses built in the 1960s and 70s. Tree-lined street, well-maintained properties, the epitome of middle-class stability. Mrs. Chen met me at her front door before I could knock. She was a small woman, maybe 5 feet 2 inches, wearing a floral house dress and an expression of deep concern that didn't match the minor nature of her complaint. "Detective Rodriguez," she said, reading my badge. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I know this sounds strange, but I need to show you something." She led me to her living room window, which provided a clear view of the house next door. 1847 Maple Grove Drive was a single-story ranch home, painted beige with brown trim. It looked perfectly normal: well-maintained lawn, clean driveway, no obvious signs of neglect or abandonment. "The Peterson family lives there," Mrs. Chen said. "Robert and Linda Peterson, and their 2 children, a boy and a girl, maybe 10 and 12 years old. I've lived here for 42 years, Detective. I've watched every family on this street come and go. But the Petersons, I only see them once a year." "What do you mean, once a year?" "Every year on December 15th, they all come outside. The whole family. They spend about 2 hours in their front yard, doing normal family things. The kids play, the parents work in the garden, they wave at neighbors. Then they go back inside, and I don't see them again until the next December 15th. I studied the house. "Mrs. Chen, are you sure they still live there? Maybe they moved and you're seeing different people who come to maintain the property?" She shook her head vigorously. "No, Detective. It's the same family. The children are growing up. I've watched them get taller each year. And I know they're living there because I can see signs of life. What kind of signs? Mrs. Chen pulled out a notebook. Apparently she'd been documenting this for years. The garbage cans go out every Tuesday night and get brought back in on Wednesday morning. But I never see who does it. The grass gets cut every 2 weeks during growing season, but I never see or hear a mower. Snow gets cleared from their driveway in winter, but I never see them doing it. She flipped through pages of meticulous notes. The house lights go on and off in different rooms at different times. I can see the glow from their television in the evening. Their mailbox gets emptied regularly. But in 11 years of living next door to them, I've only seen the family outside on December 15th. Maybe they're just very private people, I suggested, though something about her story was beginning to unsettle me. Detective, I'm retired. I spend a lot of time at home. I see the mailman, delivery trucks, neighbors walking their dogs. I notice when people come and go. The Petersons never come and go. Never. Except for December 15th. I asked Mrs. Chen to show me her documentation. What I saw made me realize this wasn't a typical neighbor complaint. She had 11 years of detailed observations. Garbage cans, always placed at exact same spot Tuesday night, always retrieved Wednesday morning. Lawn maintenance, grass cut to exactly 2.5 inches, always perfectly edged. Vehicle, 2015 blue Honda Civic in driveway, never moves, always clean. Mail, collected daily, mailbox never overfull. Utilities, electric, gas, and water meters all show regular usage. Seasonal decorations, Halloween pumpkins appear October 1st, Christmas lights December 1st, removed January 2nd. But no sightings of the Peterson family between December 15th each year. Mrs. Chen, have you tried knocking on their door? Speaking with them during their December 15th appearances? Her face went pale. Detective, that's why I called you. I've tried to approach them during their yearly appearance, but something always prevents it. Last year, I walked over to introduce myself, and Mrs. Peterson looked right at me and smiled. But when I got close enough to speak, she and the children went inside. Mr. Peterson continued gardening like I wasn't there. Maybe they're just shy. Detective, I've been watching this family for 11 years. The children were maybe 2 and 4 when they moved in. Now they're teenagers. I've watched them grow up through my window, but I've never heard their voices, never seen them interact with other neighbors, never seen them leave their property except for that one day each year. I decided to do some basic investigation. Property records showed the house was purchased in December 2010 by Robert and Linda Peterson. Utilities were current, taxes were paid, no outstanding warrants or complaints. The family had no police record, no history of domestic disturbances, no missing person reports. But when I tried to verify their employment, things got strange. The address listed for Robert Peterson's employer was a business that had closed 3 years ago. Linda Peterson's workplace had no record of her ever being employed there. The children weren't enrolled in any local schools, and there was no record of homeschooling permits. I drove by 1847 Maple Grove Drive several times over the next week, at different times of day. The house always looked occupied, lights on in the evening, curtains open during the day, the blue Honda Civic in the driveway. But I never saw anyone. On December 15, 2021, I positioned myself across the street at 9 a.m., waiting to observe the Peterson family's annual appearance. Mrs. Chen had invited me to watch from her living room window. At exactly 10:30 a.m., the front door of 1847 Maple Grove Drive opened. What I witnessed defied everything I thought I knew about human behavior. The Peterson family emerged like actors taking the stage. Robert Peterson, maybe 45 years old, wearing jeans and a polo shirt, carrying garden tools. Linda Peterson, similar age, in casual clothes, carrying a watering can. 2 teenagers, a boy about 16 and a girl about 14 wearing typical teenage clothes. For 2 hours, they performed a perfect tableau of suburban family life. Robert worked in the garden, trimming bushes and raking leaves. Linda watered plants and swept the front porch. The teenagers played catch in the front yard, laughing and calling to each other. They waved at neighbors who passed by. They looked completely normal, completely natural, completely alive. But something was wrong. I couldn't identify it at first, but their behavior felt rehearsed. Like they were following a script they'd memorized. The boy would throw the ball to his sister, she'd catch it, laugh, and throw it back. Same sequence, same timing, same laughter. Robert would rake leaves into a pile, Linda would water the same 3 plants in the same order, then return to the house to get something before coming back out. I decided to approach them. As I walked across the street, Robert Peterson looked up from his gardening and smiled. "Beautiful day, isn't it, officer?" "Detective Rodriguez, Riverside Police. Just wanted to introduce myself, make sure everything's okay in the neighborhood." "Oh, that's very kind of you," Linda Peterson said, joining the conversation. "We're doing wonderfully. The children are enjoying the nice weather." I looked at the teenagers, who had stopped playing catch and were standing nearby, smiling politely. "Do you kids go to school around here?" The boy opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, Linda Peterson interrupted. "Oh, we homeschool. They're such good students." "That's great. What grade are you in?" I asked the boy directly. Again, before he could answer, Robert Peterson stepped forward. "Officer, we don't want to keep you from your important work. Is there anything specific we can help you with?" I tried several more times to engage the children directly, but every time, one of the parents would intercept the conversation. The kids would just smile and nod, never speaking for themselves. After about 20 minutes of this awkward interaction, Linda Peterson announced, "Well, we should head inside for lunch. It was lovely meeting you, Detective." And just like that, the entire family went inside. The front door closed, and 1847 Maple Grove Drive returned to its silent state. I spent the rest of the day watching the house. No lights came on, no movement in the windows, no signs of life. It was like the family had vanished the moment they stepped inside. Over the following weeks, I conducted a more thorough investigation. I discovered that the Peterson family had no credit history beyond their home purchase. No employment records, no medical records, no school records for the children. They existed on paper just enough to own a house and pay utilities, but there was no trace of them living actual lives. I interviewed other neighbors on Maple Grove Drive. Everyone remembered the Peterson family's December 15th appearances, but nobody had ever seen them at any other time. Nobody had ever had a real conversation with them beyond polite greetings during their annual emergence. Mr. Frank Williams, who lived across the street, told me, "I've been trying to figure out what Robert Peterson does for work for 10 years. During their December visits, I've asked him several times, and he always gives vague answers about consulting work or remote projects. But I've never seen him leave for work, never seen work vehicles at the house, nothing." Mrs. Sarah Thompson, who lived 2 doors down, said, "I've invited Linda Peterson to neighborhood coffee gatherings for years. She always smiles and says she'd love to come, but she never shows up. I've stopped by their house with invitations, but nobody ever answers the door." The most disturbing information came from Joey Martinez, the mail carrier who'd served the route for 15 years. "Detective, I've always wondered about that house," he said. "I deliver mail there every day, bills, advertisements, the usual stuff. But I've never seen anyone collect it. The mailbox is always empty when I arrive, like someone's taken the mail, but I've never seen who does it." I decided to conduct surveillance on the house. For 2 weeks in January 2022, I parked at different locations around Maple Grove Drive at various times, watching for any signs of the Peterson family. What I discovered was impossible to explain. The house showed all the signs of being occupied: lights turning on and off, television glow in the evenings, garbage cans appearing and disappearing, lawn maintenance. But I never saw anyone enter or leave the house. Never saw anyone at the windows. Never saw the blue Honda Civic move. I obtained a warrant to check utility records. The house was consuming normal amounts of electricity, gas, and water for a family of 4. The consumption patterns suggested regular daily activity: someone was cooking, bathing, watching television, running appliances. But where was the family between December 15th appearances? On March 8th, 2022, I decided to knock on the door during a weekday afternoon. No answer. I could hear a television playing inside, could see lights on, but nobody came to the door. I walked around the house, looking in windows. The curtains were drawn, but I could see glimpses of a normally furnished home. Food on the kitchen counter, books on the coffee table, children's backpacks by the front door. The house looked like a family had just stepped out for a few minutes. But according to Mrs. Chen's 11 years of observation, that family wouldn't appear again until December 15th. I consulted with the FBI about potential witness protection situations, but there was no record of the Peterson family in any federal database. I contacted social services about the children, but without evidence of abuse or neglect, and without actually seeing the children, there was no basis for intervention. The case consumed me for months. I drove by the house almost daily, looking for any sign of the Peterson family. I interviewed every neighbor within a 3-block radius. I researched the house's history, previous owners, any connection to criminal activity or suspicious circumstances. Nothing. On December 15, 2022, I was ready. I positioned myself across the street with Mrs. Chin, and we waited for the Peterson family's annual appearance. At exactly 10:30 a.m., the front door opened, and the Peterson family emerged for their yearly performance. But this time, something was different. The children were a year older, taller, more mature. They moved with the same rehearsed precision, but their faces looked tired, strained, like they were actors who'd been performing the same play for too long. I approached the family again, determined to get real answers. Mr. Peterson, I'm Detective Rodriguez. We met last year. I'd like to ask you some questions about your family's living situation. Robert Peterson's smile faltered for just a moment, then returned to its practiced brightness. Of course, Detective. Though I'm not sure what you mean by living situation. We live quite normally. Where do you work, Mr. Peterson? Consulting. Remote work. Very flexible schedule. What kind of consulting? Business development. Strategic planning. You know how it is. Every answer was perfectly vague, perfectly reasonable, and perfectly meaningless. I tried a different approach. Your neighbors are concerned because they only see your family once a year. Can you explain why you're so rarely visible outside your home? Linda Peterson joined the conversation. Oh, we're just very private people, Detective. We prefer to keep to ourselves. Is there a law against that? Not at all. But your children, they're not enrolled in local schools, there's no record of homeschooling permits, no pediatric medical records. I'm concerned about their welfare. For the first time, I saw genuine emotion cross the parents' faces. Fear. Our children are perfectly healthy and well-educated, Robert Peterson said, his voice tight. I don't appreciate the implication that we're neglecting them. I looked directly at the teenagers. Can you tell me your names? The boys started to speak, but Linda Peterson immediately stepped between us. Detective, I think this conversation is over. If you have official business with our family, you can contact our attorney. What attorney? What law firm? But the Peterson family was already walking toward their house. Within minutes, they were inside, and 1847 Maple Grove Drive returned to its year-long silence. That was 8 months ago. I've continued monitoring the house, but it's the same pattern: signs of occupation, but no sightings of the family. I've consulted with missing persons experts, child welfare specialists, and even paranormal investigators, though I don't believe in supernatural explanations. The Peterson family exists. They're living in that house. But somehow, they're only visible to the outside world for 2 hours each year. My name is Officer Janet Martinez, and I've been working the graveyard shift for the Brookside Police Department in Ohio for 7 years. When you work nights in a small town, you get to know every sound, every shadow, every person who has legitimate business being out after midnight. So when I started noticing Walter Hutchins on his nightly walks, I thought I was just observing another insomniac getting some exercise. I had no idea that Walter's hobby would lead me to discover a network of surveillance that connected 3 states and changed everything I thought I knew about privacy in small-town America. Brookside is the kind of place where the biggest crime is usually underage drinking or petty theft. Population 4,200, mostly working families and retirees. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone, and unusual behavior gets noticed quickly. Which is why Walter Hutchins should have stood out much sooner than he did. It started in September 2022. I was patrolling the residential area around Hickory Lane when I saw a man walking alone at 2:30 a.m. Nothing immediately suspicious. People walk at night for all kinds of reasons. Insomnia, work schedules, personal preference for cooler temperatures. But something about his pace and direction caught my attention. Walter Hutchins was maybe 55 years old, average build, wearing dark clothes that made him blend into the shadows. He walked with purpose, not the casual stroll of someone clearing their head or the brisk pace of someone exercising. He moved like someone with a destination and a timeline. I made a mental note and continued my patrol. Over the next week, I saw Walter 3 more times, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always walking the same general area but taking different routes through the residential neighborhoods. On September 18th, I decided to approach him. Standard community policing, introduce myself, make sure he felt safe, see if there were any concerns he wanted to report. Evening, sir. I'm Officer Martinez with Brookside PD. Just wanted to check in, make sure everything's okay. You're out pretty late. Walter smiled, a practiced, comfortable smile that immediately put me at ease. Oh, hello, officer. Yes, I'm a bit of a night owl. I have trouble sleeping, so I find walking helps clear my mind. Hope I'm not causing any concern. Not at all. It's good to see people taking care of their health. Do you live in the neighborhood? Just over on Spruce Circle, he said, pointing toward the east side of town. I'm Walter Hutchins. Been living here about 3 years now. Retired from insurance work, so I have the luxury of keeping out hours. Everything about the interaction felt normal. Walter was polite, articulate, had a reasonable explanation for his presence, and gave me accurate information about his residence. I told him to stay safe and continued my patrol. But over the following months, I began to notice patterns in Walter's nighttime wanderings that made me increasingly uncomfortable. First, his routes weren't random. Walter would walk through specific neighborhoods on specific nights, following patterns that took him past certain houses at predictable times. Monday nights, he'd walk through the area around Elm Street and Maple Avenue. Tuesday nights, he'd focus on the newer subdivision near Oakwood Drive. Wednesday nights, he'd walk the older residential area around Pine Street. Second, his timing was precise. When I'd see Walter on Monday nights, he'd always be passing the intersection of Elm and 3rd Street at exactly 2:45 a.m. Tuesday nights, he'd be at the corner of Oakwood and Birch at 3:15 a.m. His routes might vary slightly, but his timing at specific locations was consistent to the minute. Third, he carried equipment. At first glance, it looked like Walter was just carrying a small backpack and maybe a water bottle. But during a closer observation in October, I realized he was carrying what appeared to be a small camera, a notebook, and some kind of electronic device that he'd occasionally check. By November 2022, I was conducting informal surveillance on Walter's nighttime activities. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. Walter wasn't just walking for exercise or insomnia relief. He was systematically documenting the residential areas of Brookside. I watched him photograph houses, record information in his notebook, and use what I later realized was a handheld scanner to monitor police radio frequencies. On November 23rd, I followed Walter at a distance during his Tuesday night route. His behavior was methodical and purposeful. He'd approach houses where lights were still on, position himself to observe interior activities, take photographs, and make notes. He'd spend extra time near houses where he could see into bedrooms or living areas. Walter was conducting surveillance on our entire town. I reported my observations to Police Chief Thompson, and we decided to investigate Walter Hutchins more thoroughly. What we found was the beginning of something much larger and more frightening than simple voyeurism. Walter's background check revealed several red flags. He'd lived in Pinehurst, Oregon, for 2 years before moving to Brookside. Before that, he'd lived in Clearwater, Montana, for 18 months. Each time, he'd rented a modest house, kept a low profile, and left no significant footprint in the community. But when Chief Thompson contacted the police departments in Pinehurst and Clearwater, we discovered a disturbing pattern. Both towns had reports of a man matching Walter's description conducting nighttime surveillance activities. In Pinehurst, residents had complained about someone photographing their homes at night. In Clearwater, there had been reports of a man with surveillance equipment walking through neighborhoods after midnight. We obtained a warrant to search Walter's residence at 847 Spruce Circle. What we found inside his house was a professional-grade intelligence operation targeting small-town communities. Walter's spare bedroom had been converted into a command center. The walls were covered with detailed maps of Brookside, marked with colored pins indicating different types of locations: schools, police stations, government buildings, wealthy residential areas, and what appeared to be homes of local officials and business leaders. But the maps weren't limited to Brookside. Walter had detailed street maps of Pinehurst, Oregon, and Clearwater, Montana, marked with similar color-coded systems. Each map showed patterns of surveillance routes, timing schedules, and target locations. The most disturbing discovery was Walter's filing system. He had comprehensive dossiers on hundreds of residents from all 3 towns. Each file contained photographs of homes, daily routine observations, family member information, work schedules, and behavioral patterns. He'd been building detailed profiles of entire communities. Walter's computer contained thousands of photographs taken during his nighttime surveillance activities. Pictures of people in their homes, often unaware they were being observed. Images of children's bedroom windows, family activities, and private moments that should never have been documented by a stranger. But the scope of Walter's operation became clear when we found his communication logs. Walter wasn't working alone. He was part of a network of individuals conducting similar surveillance operations in small towns across the Midwest and Western United States. The communications revealed a coordinated effort to map and document rural and small-town communities. Walter's contacts included individuals using similar methods in towns across Ohio, Montana, Oregon, Kansas, and Iowa. They were sharing information, comparing techniques, and building a comprehensive database of small-town America. We arrested Walter on November 30, 2022, on charges of stalking, invasion of privacy, and possession of surveillance equipment for illegal purposes. During his interrogation, Walter remained calm and cooperative, but he refused to explain the ultimate purpose of his surveillance network. "Officer Martinez," he said, "you live in a small town. You think you know your neighbors, you think you understand your community. But how much do you really know about the people around you? How much do they really know about you? What does that have to do with photographing people in their homes? Information is valuable, officer. Understanding behavioral patterns, social networks, economic structures, these things have value to people who know how to use them." "What people? Who are you working for?" Walter smiled the same practiced smile I'd seen during our first encounter. "I think I'd like to speak with an attorney now." The FBI became involved when we shared Walter's files and discovered the multi-state scope of his operation. What they found was a sophisticated data collection network targeting small communities across rural America. The surveillance wasn't random. Walter and his network were focusing on towns with specific characteristics: populations between 2,000 and 10,000, limited law enforcement resources, high trust levels between residents, and economic dependence on one or two major employers or industries. The FBI's investigation revealed that Walter's network was selling their collected information to various clients, including private investigators, insurance companies, marketing firms, and what appeared to be criminal organizations planning various types of fraud or theft operations. Walter's detailed knowledge of residents' routines, family structures, and economic situations was being used to target communities for everything from identity theft schemes to elaborate confidence scams. His surveillance data helped criminals understand which houses to avoid, those with security systems or alert neighbors, and which to target: elderly residents living alone, families with predictable schedules, homes with valuable items visible through windows. But the most disturbing aspect of Walter's operation was how long it had been going on without detection. His methods were specifically designed to exploit the trust and limited surveillance capabilities of small-town communities. During the FBI investigation, I learned that similar surveillance operations had been reported in dozens of small towns across multiple states. In each case, residents had noticed strangers walking at night, but the individuals involved were polite, had reasonable explanations for their presence, and never engaged in obviously criminal behavior. Walter Hutchins was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for his role in the surveillance network. The FBI's investigation led to arrests in 6 states, and the dismantling of a data collection operation that had been targeting small communities for over a decade. But what haunts me most about the Walter Hutchins case is how vulnerable our community was to this type of exploitation. For months, Walter walked freely through Brookside, documenting our lives, learning our secrets, and building profiles that could be used to harm us. And we never suspected anything because he was polite, had reasonable explanations, and operated in ways that didn't trigger our limited security awareness. The case changed how I approach night patrol. Now I pay attention to patterns, not just isolated incidents. I look for individuals who appear in the same locations at regular intervals, even if their presence seems innocuous. I've learned that in small-town policing, the most dangerous threats often come from people who work hard to appear normal and unthreatening. Since Walter's arrest, I've been in contact with other small-town police departments, sharing information about surveillance techniques and warning signs. What we've discovered is that Walter's network was just one example of how small communities are being systematically studied and exploited by people who understand our limitations and vulnerabilities. The residents of Brookside felt violated when they learned about Walter's surveillance activities. Many people installed security systems, changed their routines, and became more suspicious of strangers. The trust that makes small-town life attractive was damaged by the knowledge that someone had been watching us, learning us, and preparing to use that knowledge against us. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I've been a social worker with Summit County Children's Services in Colorado for 12 years. I've investigated cases of abuse, neglect, and exploitation that would break most people's hearts. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered about Pastor William Hayes and the Riverside Community Church in the small town of Cedar Falls. What started as a routine investigation into financial irregularities became the key that unlocked a conspiracy spanning 3 states, connecting all the cases that had been haunting small-town America. The truth about Pastor Hayes revealed the real purpose behind David Chen's behavioral studies, Walter Hutchins' surveillance network, and even the mysterious Peterson family. Cedar Falls, Colorado, sits in a valley surrounded by pine forests, population 3,100. It's the kind of place where the church is still the center of community life, where people leave their doors unlocked and trust their neighbors. The Riverside Community Church had been serving the community for over 60 years, and Pastor Hayes had been their spiritual leader for the past 8 years. The investigation began on February 14, 2023, when I received a call from Margaret Sullivan, the church's volunteer bookkeeper. Mrs. Sullivan was 72 years old, had been managing the church's finances for 15 years, and had never reported any concerns before. "Mr. Thompson, I need to speak with someone about irregularities in our church accounts," she said, her voice shaking. "I've discovered some transactions that I can't explain, and Pastor Hayes has been very evasive when I've tried to discuss them. Church financial disputes are unfortunately common. Pastors sometimes make poor financial decisions, or there are disagreements about how donations should be spent. I expected to find typical issues: unauthorized purchases, poor record keeping, maybe some minor misappropriation of funds. I was wrong." Mrs. Sullivan met me at the church on February 16. Riverside Community Church was a modest building on Elm Street, with white siding and a simple steeple. Inside, it was clean and well maintained, with wooden pews that could seat about 200 people. Pastor Hayes' office was in the back, filled with religious books and family photos that portrayed him as a devoted husband and father. "Mr. Thompson, I've been trying to reconcile our accounts for the past 3 months," Mrs. Sullivan said, spreading financial documents across a table in the church basement. "We have regular donations from our congregation, special offerings from missions and community outreach, and some investment income from an endowment fund." She showed me the church's official budget, about $180,000 annually, which was typical for a small-town congregation. Monthly expenses included Pastor Hayes' salary, utilities, building maintenance, and community programs. "But look at these transactions," Mrs. Sullivan said, pointing to bank statements. "Over the past 2 years, there have been regular transfers to accounts I've never seen before. $5,000 here, $8,000 there, sometimes $15,000 at a time. When I add them up, we're talking about over $200,000 that's been moved out of church accounts." The transfers were labeled as mission support and community outreach, but Mrs. Sullivan had no documentation for these programs. When she'd asked Pastor Hayes about them, he told her they were confidential charitable activities that required discretion to protect the recipients. "Mr. Thompson, I've been managing these accounts for 15 years. I know every legitimate expense this church has. These transfers aren't going to any programs I'm aware of." I asked Mrs. Sullivan if she'd confronted Pastor Hayes directly about the discrepancies. "I tried," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Last week, I asked him for detailed records of these mission programs. He became very intense. He told me that questioning God's work was a dangerous path, and that some aspects of ministry require faith, not accounting." "Did he threaten you?" "Not directly. But he said that people who interfere with God's plan often find themselves facing unexpected challenges. He mentioned that Mrs. Peterson, who used to help with bookkeeping before me, had to stop volunteering due to family problems that required her full attention." This caught my attention. "Mrs. Peterson? Linda Peterson?" "Yes, do you know her?" "She and her family moved away several years ago. Pastor Hayes said their situation required them to maintain a very low profile for their own protection." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February cold. Linda Peterson was the name of the mother and the family that Detective Rodriguez had been investigating in Riverside, California, the family that only appeared once a year but somehow lived in their house year-round. I asked Mrs. Sullivan for copies of all financial records related to the suspicious transfers. What I found when I analyzed them was evidence of a sophisticated money laundering operation disguised as church charitable activities. The pattern was complex but consistent. Donations would come into the church from the congregation, then be transferred to accounts labeled as mission support. But when I traced these accounts, they led to shell companies and private individuals with no apparent connection to legitimate charitable work. Some of the money was going to consulting fees for behavioral research, paid to a company registered under the name D. Chin, the same David Chin who had conducted surveillance studies in Clearwater, Montana, while using the alias Harold Brennan. Other transfers were paying for security consulting services provided by W. Hutchins, Walter Hutchins, who was now in federal prison for operating surveillance networks in small towns across the Midwest. The largest transfers were going to something called Family Relocation Services, which appeared to be connected to helping people disappear completely while maintaining the appearance of normal lives in their communities. Pastor Hayes wasn't just stealing church money. He was using the church as a front for a network that was systematically studying, surveilling, and manipulating small-town communities across multiple states. On February 28th, I arranged a meeting with Pastor Hayes under the pretense of discussing community outreach programs. I wanted to observe his behavior and see if I could gather more information about his operation. Pastor William Hayes was an impressive figure, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that made people trust him instantly. He'd built a reputation in Cedar Falls as a compassionate leader who cared deeply about his congregation and community. People came to him with their problems, their secrets, their fears. "Mr. Thompson, welcome to Riverside Community Church," he said, greeting me in his office. "Mrs. Sullivan mentioned you're interested in our community outreach programs. I'm always happy to discuss how we serve our neighbors. I understand you support several mission programs that require discretion. Can you tell me more about those? Pastor Hayes' smile never wavered, but I saw something shift in his eyes. Some of our charitable work involves helping people in very difficult situations, Mr. Thompson. Domestic violence victims, families facing threats, people who need to rebuild their lives in safe environments. Discretion isn't just preferred, it's essential for their protection. That's admirable work. How do you identify families who need this type of help? We have partnerships with other organizations that specialize in community assessment and safety evaluation. They help us understand where our resources can be most effectively used. He was describing David Chen's behavioral research and Walter Hutchins' surveillance network as community assessment and safety evaluation. What happens to families once you've provided this assistance? We help them establish new routines, new identities when necessary, new ways of living that protect them from whatever dangers they were facing. Some families need to maintain very low profiles while they rebuild their lives. Pastor Hayes was describing the Peterson family's situation, people who were living hidden lives while maintaining the appearance of normal community members. Pastor Hayes, this sounds like witness protection work. Are you connected to law enforcement agencies? For the first time, his composure cracked slightly. Mr. Thompson, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of your visit here. Are you investigating our church for some reason? I'm a social worker with Summit County Children's Services. Mrs. Sullivan has raised concerns about financial irregularities in church accounts. I'm trying to understand how church funds are being used. Pastor Hayes stood up, his demeanor completely changed. The warm, pastoral manner was replaced by something cold and calculating. Mrs. Sullivan is an elderly woman who's become confused about financial matters she doesn't understand. I've been trying to spare her the embarrassment of making accusations she can't support. Pastor, I've reviewed the financial records. There are substantial transfers to accounts that can't be properly documented. As someone responsible for protecting children's welfare, I need to understand if any of these programs involve families with minors. Mr. Thompson, I think this conversation is over. If you have official business with this church, you can contact our attorney. But I wasn't done investigating. Over the next 2 weeks, I dug deeper into Pastor Hayes' background and the network he was operating. What I discovered was a conspiracy that had been running for over a decade. Pastor Hayes had been using his position in small-town churches to identify vulnerable families and individuals who could be exploited for various purposes. David Chen's behavioral studies provided detailed profiles of community dynamics and individual vulnerabilities. Walter Hutchins' surveillance network gathered intelligence about daily routines, security weaknesses, and valuable targets. But Pastor Hayes was the coordinator, using his religious authority to gain access to people's most private information and deepest secrets. Parishioners would come to him with marriage problems, financial difficulties, family conflicts, and legal troubles. He'd offer to help, then use their vulnerabilities to recruit them into his network or exploit them for financial gain. The family relocation services that Pastor Hayes was funding weren't helping victims, they were helping criminals disappear. Families like the Petersons were people who owed money to dangerous individuals, had committed crimes, or possessed information that made them valuable to Pastor Hayes' network. They were being hidden in plain sight, maintaining minimal community presence while serving as assets for various illegal activities. The FBI raid on Riverside Community Church occurred on March 15, 2023. What they found in Pastor Hayes' office was a treasure trove of information about criminal activities spanning multiple states and involving dozens of small communities. Pastor Hayes had been selling access to vulnerable families to various criminal organizations. Insurance fraud schemes, identity theft operations, money laundering networks, and even human trafficking organizations were paying for the intelligence that his network provided. The behavioral studies, surveillance operations, and community infiltration weren't random crimes, they were components of a systematic effort to map and exploit rural America's most trusted institutions and relationships. Pastor William Hayes was arrested on charges including money laundering, conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. His network included corrupt clergy in 12 states, all using their religious authority to identify and exploit vulnerable community members. The investigation revealed that Pastor Hayes had been operating similar schemes in 3 previous communities before arriving in Cedar Falls. In each location, he'd established trust, gained access to private information, then used that access to facilitate criminal activities before moving on to the next town. But the most disturbing aspect of the Pastor Hayes case was how easily he'd exploited the trust that makes small communities function. People had shared their deepest secrets with him, believing they were speaking to a spiritual advisor who would help them. Instead, they were providing intelligence to someone who was systematically destroying the communities he pretended to serve. The ripple effects of Pastor Hayes' arrest devastated Cedar Falls. Families discovered that their private confessions had been documented and potentially shared with criminals. Financial donors learned that their charitable contributions had funded surveillance operations against their own neighbors. The congregation struggled with the knowledge that their spiritual leader had been using their faith to facilitate criminal activities. Mrs. Sullivan, the bookkeeper who had first reported the financial irregularities, told me she felt guilty for not investigating sooner. "Mr. Thompson, I trusted him completely. We all did. How do you recover from learning that someone you viewed as a moral authority was actually predating on your community?" The Pastor Hayes investigation connected all the cases that had been troubling small-town law enforcement across multiple states. David Chen's behavioral studies in Clearwater, Montana, Walter Hutchins' surveillance network in Brookside, Ohio, and the Peterson family's hidden existence in Riverside, California, they were all part of Pastor Hayes' systematic exploitation of small-town America. The network had been identifying communities with high trust levels and limited security awareness, then using religious, professional, and social infiltration to gain access to private information that could be monetized through various criminal enterprises. Pastor Hayes was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. His network's dismantling led to arrests in 15 states, and the exposure of criminal activities that had been operating undetected in small communities for over a decade. But the damage to these communities' trust and social cohesion may never fully heal. The revelation that their most trusted institutions and relationships had been systematically exploited has changed how people in these towns view their neighbors, their leaders, and their own safety. As a social worker, I've learned that the greatest threats to community welfare often come from people who work hardest to appear trustworthy and helpful. Pastor Hayes succeeded because he understood that small-town America's greatest strength, the willingness to trust and help neighbors, could also be its greatest vulnerability when exploited by someone without conscience or compassion. The investigation is closed, but the questions remain: how many other communities are being targeted by similar networks? How do we protect the trust that makes small-town life possible while defending against people who would exploit that trust for criminal purposes? And most haunting of all, how many other trusted community leaders are actually predators in disguise, using their authority to facilitate crimes against the very people they've sworn to protect and serve? Thanks so much for watching. I can't express enough how much your support means. The likes, the comments, it all really helps the channel grow. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I always take the time to read them. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on any new videos. See you next time.